You're on the edge with me, Max Keiser. Markets, finance, and scandal. Yeah, the scandals keep piling up. Just last week, we had that magical 1,000-point drop in the markets on Wall Street, and everyone seems to think, oh, it's a mystery, it's a mystery. Of course, on this show, we've been telling you point blank that this is financial terrorism, and now it's quite obvious that the terrorists are in the driving seat and they're whipping the markets around for political ends. Now, here's something. Speaking of financial terrorists, I read this in the Financial Times. Goldman Sachs, during the first quarter of this year, on 63 working days, they booked an average of $25 million in trading profits every single one of those 63 working days. This is the equivalent of flipping a coin and having it come up heads 63 times in a row. That's not random behavior, my friends. That's manufactured market manipulation, fraud, obvious, but we'll see how they deal with that in the U.S. All right, let's turn to our guest. I'm very pleased to welcome from down under, Steve Keen. Dr. Keen is a post-Keynesian economist whose work revolves around modeling financial instability and debt deflation. He's the author of Debunking Economics and runs a popular blog. Steve Keen, welcome to the show.
Good day, Max. Good to be back again.
All right, now before I get into talking about debt deflation and debt accumulation, I have to ask you a question. I just thought of this a few minutes ago and get your opinion on it. Countries like Iceland, Ireland, and Greece, because of the wrangling that goes on the investment banks on Wall Street and the ability for these banks to encumber these countries with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt they never asked for. I was just thinking that, what might be a nice way to push back for a country like Iceland is to start selling passports. If they sold passports for $20,000 a passport, they could easily get 500,000 Americans who are trying to break free of the constraints of economic tyranny in the U.S. That would raise an immediate $10 billion in cash.
Yeah, a lot of Americans are trying to renounce their American citizenship to get away from international taxation in America. So, yeah.
There's two countries that offer it right now. Nevis, St. Kitts, it costs $200,000. Dominica, it costs $75,000. So I'm thinking Iceland or Ireland or Greece, if they just offered the same service for $20,000, they could raise $10 billion immediately, and they'd get all these...
Or they could blackmail the planet with ash. It's always another way to go.
That's
just work
right.
for Greenland.
That's right, the volcanoes in Iceland. Okay, let's get into your area of specialty. We're witnessing a sovereign debt crisis after sovereign debt crisis. So before we go any further, I need you to define debt once again for our audience and for me too. What numbers are the most important to consider? Public debt as a percentage of GDP, budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, external debt as a percentage of GDP, or your favorite, interest expense as a percentage of GDP?
My favorite is actually private debt as a percentage of GDP, Max, because that really tells you just how much you've got caught up in a Ponzi system. People, when you borrow money, what you get is you get a real obligation to somebody else. So people talk about assets and say how they, if you borrow money and you buy assets with it, then if the assets rise in value, you're better off. But the valuation of assets is a fiction. That valuation only exists if people don't sell the other people who bought the same assets don't sell them when you want to hang on to them. And you then sell, you make a profit if nobody else is trading. So the valuation of assets is very much a rubbery figure game, but the amount of debt you owe somebody is an absolute obligation. If you owe somebody a debt of $1 billion and the interest rate is 10%, you've got to give them $100 million a year before you sneeze. And that's the real danger of debt. And normally, because that is such a danger for most of us, if we're actually looking at our consumption needs or our investment needs, we're a business, and we tend to make a fairly rational calculation about the amount of debt we'll take on. We do relate it to the amount of income we expect to get either from our wages or from profit flows. But when someone convinces you that there's a way of borrowing money, buying an asset, watching its price rise and selling it for a profit, reason goes out the window and you get sucked into a Ponzi scheme. And that's why the private debt to GDP ratio, both whether it's growing or falling, and how large it is compared to your income is the real sign of whether you're in deep trouble or not. And if it wasn't for the scale of private debt to GDP that existed, it was built up in the last 60 years in America, 40 years in Australia's case, similar lengths of time for most of the OECD nations. If that hadn't reached the levels it is now, we wouldn't be having sovereign debt crisis at all. It all begins from private debt.
Okay, so private debt, principally mortgage debt.
It is now. If you go back something like about, in Australia's case, let's say just a mere 20 years, then you find mortgage debt was about 1/3 what business debt was. So back in America, if you go back 30 or 40 years, you find that business debt was about twice what mortgage debt was. So for some substantial time, households weren't the ones who were in debt. It makes much more sense to lend money to businesses because they actually generate cash flow out of that money. But of course, if you can persuade business there's a bubble going on, a nice little property scheme like buying a few savings and loans here and there, or taking over some property in disused parts of Texas. Hello, Charles Keating. Hope you're enjoying your accommodation. Then you can get the business sector getting caught in a Ponzi scheme as well. And the financial system will do that. They make money out of extending debt. If they can find somebody to take it on, they will. They ran out of businesses to do it to them about 1990. And courtesy of Alan Greenspan's rescues, they jumped across lending money to the household sector instead and sucking us into a house price bubble around the globe. So that's why these days most of that debt's with the household, but it wasn't historically the case.
Okay, so there's a bit of an accounting arbitrage here. So you've got private debt, corporate debt, government debt. And of those three classifications of debt, the hardest area to fudge the accounting is on the private debt, because on the corporate side, through all kinds of accounting gimmicks, you can hide debt, and certainly the government, every time they get into deep debt, they just print more money. So the private debt, what you're saying is because it's difficult for the average person to commit accounting fraud as easily as the average corporation or the average government, this is the problem, because unfortunately the average person is not availed themselves to the same accounting fraud tricks and techniques as the corporations or the governments.
Yeah, well, you actually mentioned an interesting one there about being able to print money. The reason we're having a crisis in Europe right now is, of course, those governments can't print money because the Maastricht Treaty stops them from doing it. But you're dead right. The households are the ones that are the most difficult situation. If you go back to the 1990s, when we had the global downturn that was largely due to collapse in speculative debt by businesses, businesses could do several things that households can't do. They could go bankrupt, which is pretty hard for a household to do, very easy for a company. Corporation can sack the workers. It's rather hard for families to sack the kids. So businesses can reduce their expenses much more easily than households can. And also, households can not cut back on consumption as easily as firms can cut back on investment. So all those things mean that when households get stuck in the doo-doo of too much debt, it's much harder for them to get out of it than it is for the business sector.
So the individual versus the average corporation or government, the individual has been leaned on for this very reason. This is why it's really unfair to say that the subprime crisis or the mortgage crisis is really the result of individuals over borrowing, taking on more debt than they should have, because there's an asymmetric playing field here. The people who made those loans, the corporations, of course, don't have to pay any penalties when the debts go bad. As a matter of fact, they get bailed out. They get rewarded. Whereas the individual actually has to suffer some economic consequences. So I don't buy this idea you hear a lot saying, well, people borrowed in Ireland. They say this a lot in the Irish press. Well, the people borrowed to make these mortgages, and it's their fault. You know, that's completely false. Because
I think, Max, it's absolutely fair to say that every mum and dad should have a PhD economist and a team of financial advisors working out whether they should take out loan contracts or not. And it's really rough of you to insist that corporations hire similar people.